but it also jumpstarts the patient's immune system by activating T cells to recognize neoantigens, which then go on to also attack the tumor. This product is a very different choice. There are multiple gene therapy products in the pipeline, multiple checkpoint inhibitors, to say the least, in the pipeline, but it's the only fusion protein of this mechanism, and it gives physicians a unique choice. So just the history, we started our preclinical trials in the 2001 to 2003 timeframe. We still have some of the same scientists working with us that were running those trials. Our phase 1 program started in 2004. Our first meeting with the FDA was in 2007, not just to design the phase 2 trial, but to work on CMC, which I want to talk about because I think it's very important. So we worked the next several years. We perfected our manufacturing process. It's a very simple, elegant process. It's a microbial expression system process, and published a paper in 2011, which you can find on our website. All 5 authors for that paper still work for me and are out of our Winnipeg site up in Canada. The reason I want to bring manufacturing in is this has been a condition, bladder cancer, that's been plagued by manufacturing problems and shortages, which again has to somehow be considered in the cost effectiveness equation. Our manufacturing know-how, we think, improves our regulatory probability of success. It helps to ensure that we'll have reliable supply to meet patient needs, but it also reduces significantly the cost of goods. We think our cost of goods is significantly lower than any other products in other therapeutic areas. And the reason that's important is that gives us margin to work with payers, both government payers and commercial payers. Our goal is to go in to develop value-based contracts to work with the payer on 2 objectives. One, to lower overall healthcare costs, and second of all, to improve patient outcomes around mortality, morbidity, and quality of life. So we know bladder cancer is the most expensive cancer to treat in the US. We estimate $6 billion will be spent on bladder cancer this year through government payers, commercial payers, and patients. And we would very much like to be part of the solution of lowering that cost over time through the appropriate use of Vicinium. So we think that in addition to having a low cost, which gives us the most margin to be able to find the right price point with payers, our most compelling data are actually our secondary endpoint around time to cystectomy. We showed that patients on Vicinium have 76% of the patients are able to avoid radical cystectomy for 3 years or more. We know radical cystectomy is the most expensive line item in overall bladder cancer costs. And we think that that outcome, as we get into real world cost effectiveness analysis with payers, will allow us to have a very kind of differentiated value proposition. So that's the path we're going down. We'd like to continue to work closely with all of you. We'd like to continue to work closely with payers. Again, our goal is to reduce overall healthcare costs while improving patient outcomes around mortality, morbidity, and quality of life. And I just want to say again that it's been a very professional and transparent process with all of you, and want to thank you again for allowing us to participate. So with that, I would be glad to take any questions.
Thank you for the complimentary remarks for the ICER team. That I know that they appreciate that very much. Did anyone on the ICER team have a response or a comment that they'd like to share in response to Dr. Cannell's remarks? Steve?
Yeah, I might. I mean, I know, Tom, you're not going to be part of the policy roundtable. I think you have another representative.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I just was completely double booked today, and
that's all right.
Wasn't.
So let me give you the pitch that they may get a chance to swing at too, and I'll certainly be asking it of the other manufacturer. So the idea of lowering costs, please forgive me, but I believe your company helped supply an estimated cost around $150,000 per year for the treatment, right?
Right. That's our initial. Prior to doing any of the work with payers, that was just kind of our initial price range that we projected, right. Somewhat below the other products. But as we tried to say, we we view that very much as a starting point until we learn more.
And I mean, how would you respond to someone in Germany who would say, until you show us data that you're better than gemcitabine and docetaxel at $500 a year, why is $150,000 a year going to help us reduce healthcare costs?
I mean, what I would say is, there was an AdCom for the FDA, as you know, in December of 2019, which was the first AdCom to talk about non-muscle invasive bladder cancer since the 2015 meeting. So it'd been about 4 years. A meta-analysis was presented at that time that showed if you isolate chemotherapy, including mitomycin, gemcitabine, Valstar, and other agents, strictly for BCG unresponsive high-grade non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, you see an average complete response at 3 months of about 20%. So our product, just like Keytruda, which has already been approved, shows roughly a 40%. And to address the earlier question, our data show 40%, so not 42. But and so we were comfortable with the model the way it was. But so I would say just at 3 months, Keytruda and our product, Vicinium, are showing double the complete response of the chemotherapeutic agents. So there's not a controlled comparative trial yet, although we have proposed that for our confirmatory trial, which we would start next summer. It would actually be a controlled trial comparing our product to physician's choice of chemotherapy agents, probably mitomycin and gemcitabine. But I would say the data, when you isolate it for high-grade non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, show that our products are about twice the effectiveness, even at the 3-month mark, and arguably have a better durability.
All right, thanks. I just want to give you a brief chance to respond to that. It'll come up again on the roundtable.
Yeah, thank you very much for that opportunity.
So I think our next presenter is visible on my screen anyway. Welcome, Dr.
Yeah,
Kasturi.
good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We can. So the clock is at 5 minutes. Please begin. We look forward to your comments.
Thank you. So I'm Dr. Vijay Kasturi from FerGene. I want to thank ICER for providing me with this opportunity to address some of our concerns related to the draft report. There's a critical unmet need currently for patients with BCG unresponsive non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. There's fewer bladder preserving treatment options, and these patients oftentimes have dismal outcomes in this situation. A recent SEER Medicare study, for example, showed that in BCG unresponsive patients, up to 26% of patients progress to muscle invasive disease or metastatic disease. So, and up to 85% of patients actually are either medically ineligible or refuse cystectomy due to substantial morbidity that they have, things like COPD, other quality of life detriments, detriments to sexual function, and not insignificant mortality related to the procedure of cystectomy as well. I have been a practicing medical oncologist for 20 years in the US, in both community and academic practice. I led the genitourinary oncology program at the UMass Cancer Center for 6 years. And I spent many years in multidisciplinary clinics up until only 5 years ago, working side by side with urologists in treating patients with non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. Also, my father was one of these patients. He had high-grade non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, became unresponsive to BCG, and subsequently intravesical chemotherapy as well. He then progressed to metastatic disease and ultimately ended up dying from this disease. So I have personal experience as a caregiver for a patient who went through this process as well, besides having treated hundreds of patients with this disease. And I am committed, as is our team at FerGene, to finding new innovative therapies to fight cancer, and especially non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. Nadofaragene, for us, is a novel innovative gene therapy. It has a very favorable benefit risk profile, and we feel it can address the critical unmet needs for this very difficult to treat patient population. The high response rates that you've showcased in your presentation today and the durable responses, they meet the clinically meaningful thresholds that the FDA has set for a new therapeutic in this space. The safety profile, based on your own report that you showed earlier today, the safety profile for nadofaragene is superior. It has the lowest number of grade 3 to 5 AEs, serious AEs, or even discontinuations among all the new agents, and that includes pembrolizumab. These strong data for the efficacy and safety and overall tolerability of nadofaragene have undergone a peer review process and are going to be published in a top-tier oncology journal next week. That is not the same for either of the other two agents, including pembrolizumab, which has not been presented in manuscript form anywhere. The phase 3 trial that was done for nadofaragene was also done with high scientific rigor by the Society of Urological Oncology. It was a trial by urologists for urologists. Nadofaragene has to be given intravesically only once every 3 months. So it requires much less visits from patients to physicians compared to the alternative therapies that you're looking at here. This is less disruption to the patient's lives overall as well. I think ICER has done a very timely evaluation of this important disease area, but we do feel that ICER has significantly underestimated the cost effectiveness of nadofaragene and made some inaccurate assumptions on critical safety events, as well as the risks of progression. Your table showed no progression for pembrolizumab, whereas at the EAU Congress earlier in 2020, this year, there were 3 patients who were shown to progress to MIBC for pembrolizumab on Keynote 57 with just a little bit of additional follow-up. So this is, again, we feel that some of the treatment-specific progression estimates that were collected and analyzed were using different methodologies and may have resulted in inaccurate estimates. The progression low was very low in both nadofaragene and pembrolizumab trials, but the current cost effectiveness evaluation assumes that nadofaragene has a higher risk of progression than pembrolizumab over a patient's lifetime. This is not true. So we feel some of this should be adjusted in the final report before this report is finalized overall. And we think the incremental cost effectiveness ratio for nadofaragene could have been reduced by about 60% if the correct progression rate for nadofaragene had been used. I've given pembrolizumab and other agents, checkpoint inhibitors, to hundreds of patients, and they are significant health resource utilization costs that happen to the medical system. I think many of you who are on this panel are well aware of that. Less than 100 patient trial does not necessarily capture all those effects that occur from a systemic immunotherapy versus a intravesical local therapy, which nadofaragene is.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the comments. I ask, our clinical experts or Steve or Dave, if you have, any questions or comments or responses.
I do not.
Okay.
I would just comment that to the extent there's disagreement about the long-term responses, we have very few patients analyzed out long enough. And one of the distinctions for pembrolizumab were some of the longer-term data, and that as Dan could talk to, influenced the model. It is simply reality that we have very few patients out far enough to have good estimates way out. And if more data come in, that would certainly affect estimates of cost effectiveness.
And if I can add briefly to that.
Thanks, Dan.
We use the Kaplan-Meier estimates that were provided by the companies themselves for the 12 to 24 month recurrence and progression. And we did include those 3 patients that Dr. Kasturi was referring to so the cost effectiveness estimate for pembrolizumab actually does include those patients.
Okay. Our next commenter is Dr. Lotan from Texas. So we welcome you to the Midwest CEPAC. We appreciate your comments. If there are any other conflicts of interest that you need to disclose other than what's presented on the screen, just let us know at the beginning of your remarks. Thank you. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of the panel, and I will start by first adding that I am also a consultant for Merck and AstraZeneca, and so I guess all the various people who are with possible products in this area. I also will add that I've been treating bladder cancer patients for over 20 years and have used both gemdosi and gemcitabine and Keytruda in treating patients with BCG unresponsive disease, and have been involved in the two Adstiladrin trials of phase 2 and the phase 3, and had a patient who completed 3 years of therapy. I think that, my first comment would be that this is actually a very important area. And one of the, issues that I think are important to note is that there really is no, placebo or hypothetical treatment that includes no therapy for a patient. A patient who's having recurrent BCG unresponsive disease wants treatment. They just don't want their bladder removed because of the morbidities and potential mortality and the impact of quality of life. And so when you sit with a patient and discuss with them the potential options, you have a very limited number, and we are excited about the opportunity of having several additional therapies. The other encouraging thing about the therapies is that there are very few progression rates, and so there is a margin of safety here in terms of trying another therapy for 3 months with the hope that it will benefit you. These therapies seem to have a response in about 40 to 50% of patients, and patients will find that attractive and might even consider having 2 different therapies before being willing to have their bladder removed, which has lifelong implications. I think one of the important things that I should point out is that the gemdosi data, even though I have been using gemdosi for lack of other treatments, really is only included less than 40% of patients with BCG unresponsive disease, had a median follow-up of less than 1 year. And so using long-term data from that study and using the very low cost really led to sort of it to dominate all the other treatments. And one might ask, why do we need another treatment if gemdosi is so good? And the problem is that the data is weak from retrospective studies with short-term follow-up. And so there is a need for additional treatments to be included. I think the other important thing is that we shouldn't, even though it wasn't heavily included in the model, the toxicity profile of systemic therapies with immune therapy is concerning to patients. I understand that each individual immune therapy side effect was small, but the cumulative was close to 20%, grade 3 to 5 toxicity, and those have costs and concerns for patients who might have a significant impact from this. I think that it's difficult to model. I have done health economic modeling throughout my career, and I understand the challenges. But yet, from a clinician standpoint, I think it's important not to look poorly at the additional therapies that are available that are intravesical, based on the fact that the modeling suggests that pembrolizumab may be better when some of these cost implications have not been included, including their quality of life aspects. Finally, I do think that there is concern. There is longer term data for, at least for the FerGene product. And that does have an impact when you consider the rest of the life, looking at a very low rate of recurrence and progression for Keytruda and gemdosi compared to FerGene, which is biased against it in the model. And one can even see that in terms of quality adjusted life years, where one sees a significant benefit for these other treatments, primarily because they were assumed to have low progression rates. And I'm not sure that that's completely accurate. And I recognize that there is a lot of uncertainty with lacking data. The final comment I would say is that all these companies design their trials based on FDA guidance, and the lack of comparison arm is viewed negatively by people who are viewing this, but is understandable in the context of what the FDA required of companies, lacking an actual comparator and a hypothetical comparator. And the confidence interval, this 20%, came based on the fact that that was how valrubicin performs. So the thought being valrubicin is intravesical therapy that's been approved, and we need to do better than that. Thank you very much for your time. And again, I think ICER did a good job with the data that was available, but probably there are some refinements that could be improved. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any comments from our clinical or economic team or our clinical experts on this topic? Steve, maybe? I saw you raise your hand.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Lotan, and to all the other ones. I'd like to sort of just emphasize several of Dr. Lotan's important points. Number one is that clearly we do value, and as a practicing clinician who takes care of people whose primary care patients do get bladder cancer, new therapies clearly are needed, and why we took on these new topics. The flip side of that is that as new therapies, we don't have a lot of long-term experience with them. And the number of patients as an epidemiologist and a researcher in these trials is small. And obviously, we look forward to longer term experience with them to show that they maintain safety and efficacy. Obviously, patients do progress over time, and for patients who could consider cystectomy, the challenge of do I delay and potentially miss a cure is something that I think remains important. And then lastly, to emphasize the need for comparative studies now that we have some treatment options that I think is going to be something very important for the manufacturers and the experts to focus on to help guide us. So thanks so much.
That's great.
Thank you.
Steve Pearson, I think I'll pass it back to you, and I believe we'll probably get to a break here for a few minutes. Is that right?
Yes, so we're running a little bit behind time, but we'll be able to make it up, I think, in the next section. So let's let everybody have a 10-minute break-ish, and if we can reconvene right at 10:55 Central Time, 10 minutes from now, that would